Good evening, and welcome to our third talk in a series, Elephant in the Room, Exploring the Future of Museums. The series was organized by Stuart Swift Research Center of the Henry Sheldon Museum in Millbury, Vermont. My name is Eva Garcelon-Hart. I'd like to acknowledge that the program takes place on Dakina, which is the ancestral homeland of Abenaki people. The Elephant in the Room series was conceived to explore museum past and museum future. We invited national speakers to present their ideas, and hopefully it will generate a conversation between museum goers and speakers and us on the inside. And we would love you to, whenever you feel like, to type your questions into Q&A box, which you will find on the lower right side of the screen. So please feel free to do it as we speak. All our talks are taking place on the second Wednesday of every month between now and April of next year, at the same time, 7 p.m. of Eastern Time. We hope that you will attend our future talks, and I just would like to briefly tell you that in January, the speaker will focus on race and 19th century photography. In February, we will talk about historical maps and colonial past. In March, the speaker will tell us incredible stories about what you can uncover in archives and collections like ours. And the talk will conclude in April with a presentation about 21st century museums, as 21st century public squares. The Elephant series was organized with the generous support of Vermont Humanities. Thank you very much to Vermont Humanities. And we also received additional support from several other local organizations, including Dean's Law Firm, Marble Trail Financial, and Millbury College. So thank you to all. Today's talk, Making History with Sam's Cabinet, Imagining Feminist Period Room, is by Sarah Ann Carter, the Executive Director of the Center for Design and Material Culture, and Associate Professor of Design Studies in the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She previously served as a curator and director of research at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she collaboratively curated many museum exhibitions and led Chipstone's think tank program in a support of progressive curatorial practice. Welcome to Professor Carter and to everybody, and thank you and enjoy the evening. Good night.
Thank you so much, Eva. I'll begin sharing my screen here. Let me get started. Are you able to see that okay?
Yep, we are seeing it in presenter mode though.
You are? Okay, there we go again. Let's see. Are you able to see that okay?
That's perfect, full screen.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Eva and Taylor, for your technical help. And thank you so much to the Sheldon Museum for this warm invitation. I'm really so pleased to be asked to speak as part of this series, The Elephant in the Room, because I've long thought of the roles of history and storytelling and truth as often real elephants in the room in museum settings, things that might be assumed but not always talked about. And in my research and curatorial work, I'm really quite interested in relationships, between history and memory in museums. and what the ways of knowing that might be made possible when curators really foreground questions around history and memory and think about how these categories can help our work really connect to ideas about past, present, and future, thinking about interpretive possibilities in these spaces, and really asking what it takes for an exhibition or a museum to truly be a place that is expansive, open-ended, and generative. The exhibition, the project that I'll be talking about tonight is Mrs. M's Cabinet. Mrs. M's Cabinet is an installation that we first installed in 2016, and it's still on view at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And it really engages in this kind of vital work around history and memory and thinking about what makes an exhibition expansive and open-ended. This installation and its larger project, which you can access through mrsmscabinet.org, really allows objects and ideas to time travel in a way and to exist simultaneously in 17th, 19th, and 21st century contexts, really allowing for multiple stories and possibilities to exist at the same time. And I think of it as a kind of feminist period room, as a cabinet that really allows for a generative reframing of a wide range of objects. And in some really interesting ways, this space has become Chipstone's changing gallery, which really allows Chipstone to reframe a wide range of objects and reimagine a range of historical possibilities. Crucially, this project really draws inspiration from truths and possibilities offered in contexts like post-colonial fiction, thinking about critical fabulation, and allows us to really focus on histories of power and translation and understanding through time. And by using the period room form, as we do in Mrs. M's Cabinet, we're really attempting to rewrite and reimagine history, to make a space for stories that might be controversial, nuanced, or unexpected, and certainly unexpected in the Art Museum, where this cabinet is located. Now, I'm going to get much more into Mrs. M's Cabinet in a moment, but I think it's important for me to share a little bit more about my own intellectual story and kind of how I came to this project, because the project that I'm talking about is a period room, but it's also a period room that's very much a work of critical museum studies and is engaging in a lot of very layered questions around museums and categorization and the work that museums can do. So as part of my story, I've actually been working in museums for more than 25 years, because I actually started working in museums when I was in high school in the Harrison Gray Otis House in Boston, where I was an intern. And then I was able to spend about 15 years researching in collections throughout New England. So as a university student, and then pursuing my master's in the Winchester program in American Material Culture, studying historic interiors, girls' bedrooms in particular, and then pursuing my Ph.D. at Harvard in American Studies, where I focused on material culture and histories of museums. And throughout this time, I spent a great deal of time working in and around historic collections and house museums, in archival collections, and a whole range of institutions throughout New England. And so that really helped shape the way I was thinking about period rooms and collections. So my interest in this topic comes from spending many, many years engaging in and working in these spaces. While I was at Harvard as a PhD student and then later as a lecturer, I was able to work on this really exciting project with Laurel Ulrich, Ivan Gaskell, and Sarah Schechner, the Tangible Things Project. And what this project was all about was looking at the historical ways museums, and in our case in this project, the more than 50 systematic collections that are part of the Harvard University museums, sort and make sense of objects, categorize things, put things into categories that allow them to be collected and cataloged and made available to the public. And in doing this work, we really came up with a number of pretty interesting problems and challenges, because many things don't want to be sorted into just one category. And in fact, many things cross categories, belong in lots of different places. And when you think about it and start to look more closely at any object in a museum, you often run into this issue where questions like what is art, what is history, what is anthropology, what is a book, become categories that are not obvious and not to be taken for granted, and often not at all consistent. And so as we thought more about things that crossed categories, it really inspired us to question the nature of those very categories and the ways that things were organized and sorted. And so as part of this project, we purposely moved things all over campus. We put things in the so-called wrong collection in order to ask how and why are things placed where they are. And oftentimes that has very much to do with the historical needs of the people who collected them, assumptions that were made about race, class, and gender. And categories like art and history and anthropology seem to fall apart, or categories of, natural history and, human history, they're very interrelated, far more than separate buildings and catalogs and modes of categorization might suggest. And this is a really important project for me to be part of and to think about. And, we wrote a book out of it, and we actually created a MOOC, a massive open online course that those of you interested in these kinds of lectures might be interested in being part of. Almost 80,000 people have taken this online Harvard X course so far. And it really gets into these questions of like, how do we categorize things? Like, what is going on in a museum? What goes where? And these are questions that are actually really important to understanding, Mrs. M as well, which we'll get to. After my time at Harvard, I was really fortunate to move out to Wisconsin to the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. And I became the curator and director of research at Chipstone. Now, Chipstone, which is shown here, and Chipstone is the large brick Georgian revival house in the background, foregrounding this pretty cool sculpture by Brent Budsberg and Shannon McCaw. The Chipstone Foundation is a private foundation in Milwaukee that's really devoted to the study of American decorative arts. And it has a really fantastic collection of American decorative arts, American furniture in particular, British ceramics, and American prints. And in addition to having this wonderful historic collection, it's really focused on material culture and innovative museum practice. And in doing this work, thinks a lot about teaching and about training the next generation of material culture and museum leaders. So it does this through a series of books that Chipstone publishes, in particular American Furniture and Ceramics in America. And it also does this work through exhibitions. And these are the gorgeous wings of the Santiago Calatrava designed Milwaukee Art Museum, where Chipstone has had the great privilege of curating more than 40 exhibitions over the past 20 years. And you can access these kinds of exhibitions online if you're interested in learning more about the kinds of work that Chipstone does. And my predecessors at Chipstone, Ethan Lasser, who's now in MFA Boston, Glenn Adamson, he was previously the director of the Museum of Art and Design in New York, Sarah Fan Scarlett, fantastic professor at Michigan Tech. These colleagues working with John Prown, who is the director of Chipstone, really worked to create exhibitions that were question-driven, argument-driven, that had an interesting point of view, and that really used design to tell meaningful stories. So all of those things were really central to the work that Chipstone was doing and really laid an important foundation for Mrs. M's cabinet. And at the same time, students were invited into all of these projects. So a big part of the work at Chipstone is really asking, how do we invite people into our curatorial and collaborative process? So all of these factors are really important in creating a space in which a project like Mrs. M is possible. When I arrived at Chipstone, we had this great opportunity to also think about exhibitions that engaged in a lot of my own research interests as well, which were very much rooted in the study of historic interiors and thinking about spaces. Some of the projects that we did really sort of leaned into a period room idea in some ways. So we thought about projects like creating an 18th century print room inspired exhibition as in this installation that we did at the Haggerty Museum, or creating a 1970s lounge as a period room. to invite students to come in and to brainstorm and to think about connections between past, present, and future, which is a really fun project. We worked with students to create their own installation spaces, thinking a lot about how rooms could tell stories. In these 3 installations, we worked with graduate students who are pursuing a Master's of Architecture at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee to design whole spaces around museum objects in the collection, kind of acknowledging this idea that, you know, a room can sometimes be a better museum label than a museum label, right? How might you tell a story through a space? Or working with contemporary artists like the brilliant Canadian artist Iris Hausler to actually build a whole interior space for some of the characters that she created in her art practice, imagining a whole apartment or space to tell a story around the artwork that you know, she has created. Another view of the Iris Hausler installation that we put together. You know, or thinking about how a shop interior could be used to tell a story about histories of design. So in a lot of the projects that we were doing at Chipstone, we're really focusing on using spaces to tell stories, thinking about experience, thinking about how visitors might feel in a space. In the exhibition shown here on Florence Eisenman, who is a really fascinating designer of children's clothing from Wisconsin. Rather than just show the objects, you know, we found mid-century shop interiors and tried to use suggestions of those spaces to help us tell the story. And so in all of this work, while John Brown and I, along with the curatorial fellow Natalie Wright, were doing curatorial work, we're working very closely with a brilliant team of designers led by Brent Budsberg and his partner Shannon McCobb to do this design work. So all of these projects are very collaborative. And having these collaborative projects, we're really using all of the skills of all of these different people to think about how space can be used to tell a story, and perhaps to help us think about and pierce through some of the modes of historic categorization that you know, museums are often using sort of as a crutch to tell some of their stories. How might we do this in a new and meaningful way? And so in 2016, we decided to start thinking seriously about a new kind of installation in the Milwaukee Art Museum. We had been asked to put together, I guess we really started thinking about this in 2015, but it really came to life in 2016. We were asked to reinstall our galleries as part of the reinstallation of the Milwaukee Art Museum. And in doing this, you know, we were thinking a lot about, you know, how do we tell the story of Chipstone's collections? Chipstone's collections that, you know, look a lot like this in the Chipstone Museum in Fox Point. How do we tell those stories, tell stories about those objects in a really meaningful way? And so the Mrs. M's Cabinet project really developed out of this opportunity to reinstall Chipstone's galleries in the Milwaukee Art Museum. And our challenge, our charge, was to try to think about a creative way, in particular, to display Chipstone's historic ceramics, in particular, some of Chipstone's 17th century ceramics. And the Chipstone collection includes a really fantastic array of English ceramics, but the collection also includes a wonderful assortment of a much less well-known array of ceramics from continental Europe, from Asia, and from North Africa. And this new area of Chipstone's collecting interest really came from fantastic research done by Blythe Straub, Colonial Williamsburg, and Historic Jamestown, to really think about like what was there archaeologically. Her research as part of the Jamestown Rediscovery Project really showed scholars that there were objects found archaeologically in 17th century Jamestown that were from all over the world, but yet most museum collections were still presenting a New England through the work that they were presenting in their exhibitions. And we wanted to think about, how might we imagine a collection, an installation that reflects what was found, archaeologically in America in the 17th century. And so our curatorial team really grappled with this and wanted to think about how do we do this in an interesting way. And part of the challenge that we faced is that much of what contemporary America knows about the 17th century was invented in the 19th century. And that's when a lot of these ideas about early America really become ossified and presented and shared as these really enduring notions of what it means to be American, right? There's almost this like a monolithic image of early America as a kind of colonial revival fantasy. And our team thought about the 1876 centennial, that marked 100 years to the United States, the anniversary celebrated every year on July 4th, which presented rooms like this one, like the New England kitchen, as, a carefully framed and remembered and really quite, political version of early American colonial life, a very particular vision of what early America looks like. And scholars often think about, this period, this first colonial revival of the United States, without really asking, what kinds of stories, what kinds of histories does this memory work offer? Whose histories are included and whose aren't? If your history is about 1776 to 1876, and whose histories are hidden, right? And this really quite cosmopolitan material culture history of 17th century Jamestown is really hidden by these kinds of histories. And so as we thought about this and thought about, what kinds of stories we wanted to tell or how we might tell these stories, rather than sort of describe all this in a really long museum label, note the historiography, try to explain all of this, in a 200-word label, right, which could only scratch the surface. Our team really wondered, can we hack into this concept, or can we use these ideas in a more creative way? Is it possible to imagine another kind of historical trajectory coming from this sort of 19th century vision of the 17th century? Could we imagine a historical trajectory that really highlights this problematic history embodied in something like the colonial kitchen, that embodies this problematic history that really suggests like how a lot of stories about America's past unfold in museums? Could we suggest another set of possibilities? That's what we were really curious about exploring. And this was and is an ongoing experiment, and it's not at all finished. But Mrs. M's cabinet really became a strategy, one that has unfolded over time and is still unfolding to allow us to explore some of these topics. And we took this process of trying to explicitly and deliberately make and remake history as a central intellectual challenge. As we tried to imagine Mrs. M's cabinet, the room through this doorway, which we'll enter in a moment, my colleague John Prown and I started this project by imagining Mrs. M's obituary. Trying to imagine, like, what kind of person or character could help us do the work that we want to do? How might we tell a much broader story about 17th century America? What kind of people or who might help us do this work? And so we started thinking about Mrs. M. Our team looked to the success of late 19th century visual and material rhetoric to help us do this cultural work. And this was a period that was really defined by object-based knowledge. And interiors were often viewed as having narrative potential, as having the chance, to tell a story with every aspect of a room, offering a kind of story for a space. And we decided to sidestep, the white cube or the square-walled gallery. And you can see how we're sort of walking out of a more traditional gallery space into Mrs. M to get there. We really decided to sidestep that aesthetic, the aesthetic that you see in most of the galleries in the Milwaukee Art Museum, and to create this really quite elaborate late 19th century period room, which was inhabited by a mysterious, curious, and rather, ethical in the ways she talked about things or the way she saw herself, collector, Mrs. M. And in this way, Mrs. M's cabinet, which is the space here, and Mrs. M herself, really became interesting tools that allowed us to tell stories about power and diversity and cosmopolitan aesthetics, as well as subjectivity in the art museum. And throughout all of this, we came to really understand this as a kind of feminist period room. The room that you see here was built by the absolutely amazing artist, builder, and designer Brent Butzberg, and a team of more than 50 local makers who helped us imagine all of the details. It's really quite gorgeous space, which itself is just sort of floating inside of the kind of white walled gallery we did not want it to be, but it sits within one of those rooms. And we've transformed this gallery into an 1880s inspired interior, which is quite unexpected in the Milwaukee Art Museum, which, unlike many museums, does not have a history of period rooms. This isn't something that the Milwaukee Art Museum, in its initially, Saarinen and then later Calatrava design building does not have period rooms in it, okay? Mrs. M is a character who really comes in and out of focus in this space, right? She's someone who appears and disappears in this gallery. And as you look closely and engage with this space, there's material evidence that comes through if you're really engaging in the clues that she leaves, and which I'll share with you, that she's someone who's using objects as evidence and who's questioning authority and is adventurous and empathetic and curious. There's no Mr. M in this cabinet, and we never learn her full name. She's just Mrs. M. And her place in the world, quite by design, it seems somewhat unstable, right? We don't know as much about her. We can't really grasp too much about her story. And there are details that come and go that might allow us to think about conceptions of passing and its relationship to different kinds of historic narratives. We don't know where she comes from. We don't know that much about her, but we know about her collection and about the evidence that she leaves behind. And our curatorial team looked to a whole range of historic examples to help us develop her character. And so she's not a specific person, quite explicitly. We wanted her to be a character to be able to change over time, to grow and to develop. And she's really much more of a strategy and a story than a specific individual. Now, Mrs. M is present in this space in many ways. As I said, we did not want traditional museum labels in this space. And so the closest thing we have to a museum label in Mrs. M's cabinet is this very tiny Pepper's Ghost illusion, which is in the corner of the space. And it's projected in a paper doll size version of the room that you were in Mrs. M's cabinet. Visitors are invited to come in and pull on this golden cord. And a tiny version of Mrs. M comes out and tells us a little bit about her cabinet and her story. And this becomes the main label for this space. And in this film, she's offering a really brief synopsis of her biography as it is known. And she directly questions her visitors to reflect on the presentation of US history in museums. She asks, what is America? Where is America? Who is America? Is it a place or is it an idea? And for more than a century, these are the kinds of questions that creators of period rooms have often really sidestepped in their work. And these are actually, while they seem simple, they are deeper interpretive questions. And period rooms often simply recreate a specific moment or style or space. Whether a room is about presenting an art historical narrative or telling the story of an historic person, it's often not helping us understand some of these deeper questions or topics, not really asking us to question, like, what does it mean to be a space that talks about history, to be a space that talks about memory? How do we understand the knowledge-bearing possibilities of these sorts of spaces? For most period rooms, they simply seem like, plausible domestically scaled spaces that allow for a fantasy of walking back in time, when they really perhaps should be asking us to question, whose history, whose America, what kind of space. And period rooms have often been just viewed as, uncritical, transparent, static windows onto the past. And when we think about the kinds of curators and people who created these period spaces, people like this imagined tiny Mrs. M in here opening up her cabinet, sharing her objects with visitors. We're looking at curators and historians, many of whom historically were women who created spaces, and their stories and politics, often quite conservative politics and aims, are often erased in the telling of these stories and in the preservation of these period spaces. In effect, the kinds of historic spaces created by Mrs. M, in our case, or created by a whole range of memory keepers, in-house museums, and period rooms, often present really compelling fictions about the past. Fictions that often reflect outdated and somewhat exclusive historic narratives. And this is stuff that we know from historiography around period rooms, from critical museum studies, but this kind of work or this kind of questioning doesn't always make it into museum spaces where visitors encounter these stories. Mrs. M, in talking about her cabinet, is trying very hard in the narrative that she puts forth, that she asks, what is America? She is really trying to place her cabinet in contrast to scenes like that 1876 Centennial Exhibition New England kitchen image I showed earlier, and other fictionalized historic interiors. She is someone who, as she describes it, is explicitly collecting 17th century ceramics from around the world, ceramics that she knew from her childhood, mudlarking on the James River, ceramics that she knew existed in the 17th century because archaeologically they were present in what would go on to become the United States. And so she wants to create a cabinet that tells that much earlier story in contrast to the stories told through the Centennial Exhibition or the New England kitchen. During the US colonial revival, which was really at its height between 1876 and the sesquicentennial in 1926, female memory keepers, the kinds of people that inspired Mrs. M, created period rooms that employed, relic objects and documents and interior design to tell a kind of story. And I know, of course, our friend Sheldon, Mr. Sheldon, was, not a female memory keeper, but was doing this kind of work too in Vermont, which I know through the fantastic work of Professor Ellery Fouch. He was also thinking about relics and memory keeping, as Mrs. M was. We know that these 19th century interiors and these collections of objects are presenting, material and visual narratives as places in which their creators or documenters are trying to tell stories through objects. And so in doing this work, every aspect of Mrs. M's cabinet is really trying to convey a deliberate aesthetic and historic choice. So in thinking about Mrs. M's cabinet, we're also trying to think about how every detail in this space could tell a specific kind of story about the past. So for example, the details that helped inspire Mrs. M's cabinet, come from existing buildings and structures. One really clear example is interior woodwork that was inspired by the Isaac Bell House in Newport, Rhode Island, which dates to 1882, a McKim and White designed building shown here. The overall cabinet design is thinking about, a whole range of historic details, whether it's looking at historic figures who might inspire Mrs. M, or helping us think about details that could help us understand and make sense of the kinds of spaces that we created for her and that she lived in. As we designed this room, we also very much decided not to have any sort of 21st century tells or clues that we were in a modern museum space. After a lot of debate and discussion, we were even able, to hide the fire alarms in this space. And as I shared earlier, as we look up to the ceiling in this room, it doesn't look like the ceiling of a modern museum space. we explicitly tried to have this space feel as historic as possible, inspired by historic people, concepts, stories, and details. But, that's all just part of the work here, because like a traditional period room, one of the main purposes of Mrs. M's cabinet was really to display historic objects and to present and interpret them in a manner that really more actively considered their meaning and cultural complexity. So in the cabinet, and you can see a whole range of ceramics from Chipstone's collection displayed around this fireplace. The cabinet, the objects on display quite explicitly inhabited 3 different historical moments. The moment they were created, the moment that she chose to collect or display them, and then the present 21st century moment. And this chronological layering really emphasizes the ways that all of the objects on display in museums have their own biographies and are in effect time travelers that are existing in all of these different historical moments at the same time. They were created, they were collected, and then they were displayed where visitors can engage with them. And so like every other object in the museum, the things in this gallery were saved because of the choices that were made about them, whether it's about cultural or historical or aesthetic value at different moments. And Mrs. M's interior just presents one historical way of using these objects, one way that really offers, a more nuanced view into what they might have meant to her or how they might have made sense to her. So we're using her as this framework to try to reinterpret the objects in Chipstone's collection. So Mrs. M's cabinet is not using, as I mentioned, traditional museum labels, but is employing historic interpretive strategies to try to tell the story of the objects on display, and also creating a fuller picture of how people collected and valued historic objects. So for example, all of the ways visitors engage with objects in this space are, through the lens of historic modes of interacting with interiors and museums and period rooms. So in addition to the Pepper's Ghost illusion that I mentioned, the additional assets, the additional didactics in this space are actually Mrs. M's ledger book shown here and a scrapbook that I'll show you in a moment. So these alternative labeling strategies are available both in the gallery and online. And the ledger book, which I'm showing you here, has these wonderful images of all of the objects on display. And then in the book itself, we have Mrs. M's notes here describing them. And they're handwritten here by a local calligrapher, one of the 50 crafts people we worked with on this project, to really try to help this feel like this is Mrs. M's space. And I see a great question coming in about reception to the space, and I will be sure to answer that, Catherine, at the end, because I think that's a really important question. So we have these watercolor sketches of the objects. We have Mrs. M's notes here, so you can get a sense of how she described the objects. And this ledger is not at all how, if I were the curator with, my background, education, and experience in the 21st century, I would not describe them necessarily the way Mrs. M does. But we're trying to imagine, hacking into this idea of a 19th century collector engaging with these objects from the 17th century. How might they engage? So she notes, for example, a particular dish is Ottoman, not Turkish, and describes objects as a careful collector might. Describing a dish as, a Spanish charger with a pensive young man on it around 1650, or a remarkably tiny Chinese porcelain wine cup. Such precious things to be part of such a hard life in Jamestown, 17th century. Like trying to imagine, how might someone have made sense of these objects? As such, the objects are given a fuller life history, a fuller biography, by understanding them in relation to a person who valued them, perhaps someone who valued them quite differently than a 21st century museum visitor might. Similarly, Mrs. M also, and you can access all of this online on Mrs. M's website, which I'll share with you at the end. Mrs. M also had another small cabinet of relics in this space. which you could access through her scrapbook, shown here. And in this project, I worked with a PhD student, to research each of the relics in this case. These are, 4-leaf clovers from Ireland in that little jar there. All these relics from all over the world. And you think about, how might Mrs. M make sense of these? Why did she collect them? What would her scrapbook look like of these objects? So you have her scrapbook and her ledger book and her Pepper's Ghost illusion to understand a little bit more about her story. Around the frieze in the room, we also have a range of names here that you can see. You can see Boston, Puebla, Iznek, Biddeford, different places that all of the ceramics come from in this space. And on this frieze, we have this listing of names that were important to the history of ceramics in Mrs. M's time and in the context in which she was collecting, thinking about creating an unfamiliar geography for visitors too, and thinking about another way of making meaning out of some of these objects. So her research on ceramics found in Jamestown really helps her make a rhetorical argument about the diversity of objects present in early America, as well as thinking about the object-based epistemology of the late 19th century, which was a really key way that scholars know 19th century Americans understood material things. There are lots of objects where we could explicitly think about them moving through time. This is a great example in Mrs. M's cabinet as well. This is a Boston chest, which is from 1660 to 1680, which is in Chipstone's collection. But inside of this chest, it was altered in 1865 with the addition of a newspaper that you see there under the lid, which is telling the story on mourning the death of Lincoln. So it's an object that we have with a 17th century story, a 19th century story, and then here it is in the 21st century. This is the kind of time travel feeling that we're trying to invite visitors into in Mrs. M's cabinet, to invite them to remember that all of the objects on display in a museum have these stories. Overall, the cabinet really operates on the conceit that Mrs. M exists, that she's present in the Pepper's Ghost illusion, that she's present in her scrapbook and her ledger book, as well as in the design of the room and the collecting choices that she makes. And all of these clues give us a few cues about her character. They help us know a little bit more about how she approaches things. So she's someone who's questioning the authority of the sort of colonial revival context in which she's living in. She's interested in evidence like the archaeological shards that she unearthed. And she's curious and empathetic. And to try to think about her story, we looked to historic examples of 19th century women researchers doing some of this work. Like, for example, US textbook author Mary Sheldon Barnes, who played a big role in my own doctoral research and later book on object lessons, or C. Alice Baker from Deerfield, or the historian of decorative arts, Alice Morse Early. People who could help us understand more about Mrs. M's context. But Mrs. M is also present in this space through her ongoing work and the ongoing work that she invites. So you can see here, there is a doorway where you can actually peek into Mrs. M's office, which is a changing space, which is inviting visitors to imagine the ongoing work of her collection. And by inviting visitors into this space, we're kind of piercing the fourth wall of the exhibition and suggesting that her project exhibition is a work in progress. And the hope is that these approaches are making visitors, critically aware of the subjective nature of what's happening in museum contexts, both past and present, in period rooms and throughout the larger museum. Everything in a museum is created. It feels natural when you walk in. It feels like perhaps it has always been there, but there is an embedded argument. There is a story. There is a point of view. And by inviting people to imagine Mrs. M working in her space, we're inviting people to think about the relationships among material things and curatorial perspectives and how visitors might experience those possibilities. Now, this is a central factor of Mrs. M. This is key to Mrs. M's cabinet. And I think about this as kind of the expansiveness of the project. And this really allows us to think about it far more as a generative and open-ended and really feminist period room space. The expansiveness and curiosity of Mrs. M has allowed for various modes of interpretation and explicitly is designed to invite collaboration. So for example, this semester after Mrs. M opened, I taught a graduate seminar at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where I was previous to Madison. And students in my graduate museum studies seminar called Curating Mrs. M's World, they collaborated with Mrs. M throughout the semester to develop a series of projects. They investigated her story. They thought through the organizing principles of Mrs. M's cabinet. And we really thought about this category of Mrs. M. What would Mrs. M collect? How do we define and think about Mrs. M as a category, like history or anthropology or the other categories that I'm interested in exploring and that are key to thinking about museum studies, museum histories, and museum futures. And the students were charged with creating new installations in her cabinet for 7 historic objects chosen from the Chipstone collection. And so even though they were art historical students, they had to think about how would they make this stuff meaningful to Mrs. M, right? How would they make this meaningful to her? How might they use the rhetoric of 19th century modes of display to do this work? How might they imagine the category of Mrs. M being played out and contextualizing new objects? So for example, one student who was asked to figure out a way to display this really quite fantastic 1876 centennial vase there from Brooklyn, was asked to try to critique this vase through Mrs. M, or he wanted to critique it because he thought Mrs. M might not like this, but it has to go in the cabinet. So we decided to present it with sunflowers, which could stand in for false riches, thorn apple for deceitful charms, and scarlet geranium for stupidity. So he spent some time researching the language of the flowers. And even though those of us who researched the 19th century know it was unlikely that people, often gave folks bouquets like this to send a specific message, this was part of, the object-based epistemology of the 19th century world, the concept that flowers could convey information. And so he decided to create this bouquet to try to tell this story in the context of Mrs. M's other forms of 19th century modes of display and storytelling. Other installations emphasize Mrs. M's ingenuity. So for example, one of the objects that we decided to put in Mrs. M's cabinet is an African-American memory jug, shown here. We decided Mrs. M might want to x-ray this. She'd want to use the latest technology to try to figure out this object. And so that became another installation, like asking, what questions would Mrs. M ask? How might we make sense of this? Similarly, another student thought about, creative ways to ask questions about other objects on display. In this case, putting an object related to the Chicago fire, the Chicago fire picture here inside of the wall, and creating, creating an interactive where you pull this book off the shelf and a program begins inside the wall where you can hear the voice of Mrs. M talking about how Mrs. O'Leary and her cow were wrongly blamed for this. So we thought about all these different ways that objects could be brought into this space creatively. Throughout all of this is documented in Mrs. M's log on the website that goes along with the project. And it was also documented through the Art Museum's blog as well. The room also included things like calling cards so that visitors could continue to engage with Mrs. M when they, left the museum. On the back of her calling card, you could find her website and you could engage with these stories and this work and download even more information about the larger project. Now, the result of this interpretation really was a museum-based project that is explicitly purposeful and open-ended, which are some of the goals that we believe are complementary, that our team felt, you can be both purposeful and open-ended. And apart from the obvious ways in which, Mrs. M is a female scholar and collector trying to revise established narratives, this intellectually capacious style is really key to understanding the cabinet as a kind of, feminist approach to a curatorial practice. I think that's open-ended, that it's inviting collaboration. In Mrs. M, we're really taking seriously alternate modes of history making and really trying to emphasize the variety of stories that are available to curators and ways of storytelling. And the exhibition is explicitly open source in the sense that the curatorial team, graduate students, artists, colleagues, collaborators continue to develop Mrs. M's story through their own research and interventions. So some of these are things that we've, staged, or we've invited in scholars to give salons in Mrs. M's cabinet, which are then recorded and shared on her website, where we would hold events in her space to really talk about objects or stories that might be of interest to her. As you can see, we don't have PowerPoint going in here. We worked with visitors to create images in ways that Mrs. M might understand them, and that would work in this intimate cabinet space, and they were then professionally recorded so they could be shared. The space also became Chipstone's changing gallery for a few years. A changing gallery curated with, for, and explicitly through Mrs. M. And this has allowed us to scaffold projects that would otherwise be harder to do in a major art museum, because these aren't exhibition-sized projects. These are smaller interventions that still tell important stories. So for example, in the summer of 2018, my Ph.D. student, Kendra Greendeer, who's doing an absolutely brilliant dissertation on Indigenous women artists and rematriation of seeds and other cultural objects. It's a really brilliant project. She's HoChunk, and she put together an installation of late 19th century HoChunk objects that she had been working with in the Little Legal Arts Foundation, a small museum in Wisconsin. And this was the first installation of HoChunk objects to be presented in the Milwaukee Art Museum in more than 25 years. And what Kendra did for this project was she created a story about these objects' owner based on a woman in her own family, Kate W., who would have been a peer of Mrs. M. And Kate W. met Mrs. M, while burying near her home. And Kendra chose to include baskets and carved kasu pieces shown here. They're game pieces. And really grounded this material story in a story about, friendship, cultural exchange, and aesthetics. And she wrote a lengthy letter, which is here, as well as featured on Mrs. M's website. And so what Mrs. M did was it offered a platform to invite in this story. And, the people and larger stories that this specific story could represent into an unexpected place in an unexpected way. And Kendra hosted a salon in Mrs. M's cabinet where we were able to talk through these objects and talk through this sort of imagined story of Kate W. and Mrs. M, and how we might invite that story into the Milwaukee Art Museum in a new way. Since then, there have been several other installations in Mrs. M. Currently, University of Wisconsin-Madison Ph.D. student Natalie Wright, who was formerly worked with me at the Chipstone Foundation, put together a fantastic small installation on colonelware in Mrs. M's cabinet. And now I know the current Chipstone curator, Dr. Ruthie Dibble, is interested in thinking about ceramics in Mrs. M's cabinet that might connect explicitly to women's stories or have women's names on them, right? So Mrs. M's cabinet becomes a tool for exploring ideas and thinking about what might be possible in some of these smaller exhibition spaces or two cabinets in which this work can be done. In one cabinet, a small one within the cabinet is there. And then we often have another here on top of this chest. And what we found is that it's really not too much work for the staff at the Milwaukee Art Museum to collaborate with Mrs. M. We're talking about smaller installations that are about telling targeted specific stories that connect to the possibilities Mrs. M opens up. So in all of these ways, this project is intended to be both purposeful and open-ended. Goals which, as I said, our team really feels are complementary and really central to the collaborative feminist ethos in Mrs. M's cabinet. What we try to do in this space is really use the power of material, visual, and literary tropes to try to help visitors imagine unexpected realities. Like the unexpected reality of an enigmatic lady collector who's really interested in questions around gender, race, and class related to 17th century ceramics and how those stories are presented or could be presented, within a major art museum. In doing this work, Mrs. M really allows for a rewriting of expected museum stories. And I like to think of this as vital memory work that really could make possible new ways of imagining, how objects and ideas move through time, and indeed new ways of imagining how spaces like Mrs. M's cabinet can tell new stories and invite new stories and new possibilities through the very ways in which they're designed, and through the possibility of curating with and through someone like Mrs. M, or the idea of a collaborator like Mrs. M. What might that open up? What might that invite? What might that make possible? And as I said, this is an ongoing experiment. And I think that that makes it even more exciting because we don't know what may happen next, or how new colleagues and collaborators might imagine, reimagine, or reframe Mrs. M's cabinet. So I will leave it there and hope to have some questions and conversation.
All right, well, thank you so much, Sarah. This has been an incredible project to hear about. And as you saw, we already had questions coming in as you were still speaking. So the first one is from Catherine Brooks. I so admire your work. What kind of reaction has the exhibit stimulated among visitors? Have you conducted a research component to evaluate the exhibit's effectiveness?
Thanks for that question. I think of that as it's really kind of a two-part question. So what's been really exciting is, when we first opened Mrs. M's cabinet, I spent a lot of time in the space. At that time, I had, a 2.5-year-old, and I was in there with the stroller a lot, just hanging out, listening to people, talking to people, really trying to understand how people were engaging with Mrs. M. And it was a space that really inspires a lot of wonder and a little bit of confusion, I have to say. Oftentimes visitors walk in and they're like, where are we? We didn't know there was a period room here. People have been coming to the museum, for decades. There aren't too many new period rooms of this scale, being built in, 2016. So people were surprised. And so there's a sense of wonder, sometimes confusion, but then that wonder often allowed people to stay there for a really long time. And talking to a lot of the guards in this space, who are often the absolute best people to talk about museum installations with, as many of my museum colleagues probably know, I say people spend a lot of time in here. People are curious. There's also places to sit in Mrs. M's cabinet. We have a reproduction of a 17th century turned chair, which says, please be seated. This really neat Cromwellian chair, as Mrs. M might have called it. There's a bench that you can sit in. So it's a comfortable place for sitting and engaging, paging through her scrapbook. So we know anecdotally that visitors spent a lot of time in this space. Chipstone doesn't do a lot of, the traditional museum survey where you're asking every single person, what they think of this space, because you don't often get great information through that. In this kind of installation, in our opinion, I think we could certainly do a lot more qualitative work to understand the space. What I find really interesting is that a lot of curators have very strong reactions to Mrs. M. Some people absolutely love it and feel like it's opening up new questions and new possibilities. And some curators are really quite uncomfortable by the fact that she doesn't exist and that we don't explicitly tell visitors that she doesn't exist, right? And so for some people that makes them very uncomfortable, even though that kind of information isn't necessarily provided for other display strategies throughout the museum. I mean, one could argue neoclassical doesn't exist as a concept, yet there may well be a gallery called neoclassical, and we don't have to explain to someone that neoclassical is an historic construct. Mrs. M is also an historic construct. I'm not saying it's exactly the same thing, but in doing this installation, we're kind of poking at that idea a little bit. And I certainly don't expect that every visitor who comes to Mrs. M's cabinet understands the layers that I've shared with you today. But our hope is that people are curious, engaged, and trying to kind of understand what's going on, which is something we want to have people do in museums, right? Museums can be spaces of critical thinking and questioning. So that's a very long answer to what's an important and ongoing, series of questions that I have myself. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm so interested by this idea that curators in particular, were uncomfortable with the fact that the woman kind of behind the curtain doesn't exist, especially coming from the perspective of the Henry Sheldon Museum. We are a collection grounded in Henry's collection. We are a museum grounded in his objects, but none of even what we refer to as period rooms are truly Henry's vision. They've become over time sort of fantasies of Henry's lifetime, using objects that are both his and objects that were acquired long after Henry's death. So it's even with a real figure kind of looming over our museum, we butt up against these same kinds of conversations.
Exactly. And I think that is so interesting because there is still this desire for there to be some kind of like pure or true version of the past. Though as all of us who work in museums or engage in any kind of history work know that, we're constantly making arguments and telling stories, right? And doing our best to tell as accurate a version of the past as we can, but it's always through a particular point of view, and we can't escape that. And so Mrs. M is hopefully underlining that subjectivity. And it sounds like in the Henry Sheldon context, like you can tell his story, but you can also tell the story of the museum that's continued to be created around him, which is probably just as fascinating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now a question from Sally Morris, who it sounds like really wants to come visit this installation. Are there visiting hours? Can small groups make arrangements to see the collection? And are there docents available to facilitate tours if arranged?
Yeah, so Mrs. M's cabinet is on view in the Milwaukee Art Museum. Anyone can go when the museum is open. But if anyone is in Milwaukee and wants to visit, I would be happy to show them the cabinet. I live not too far from the Milwaukee Art Museum. And that's absolutely a possibility. But Mrs. M's cabinet is it's open to the public. And hopefully there will be more salons in the future. So I'm no longer the curator and director of research at Chipstone because I'm now a professor at Madison and I run the Center for Design and Material Culture there. But Chipstone continues to interpret this cabinet, and the hope is that it will continue to host salons and continue to think through this category over time. So I'd be very happy to talk to anyone who's interested in visiting.
All right, and a question from Diane Palmieri: is music represented in Mrs. M's cabinet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did have a fantastic salon with a band that produces music like from her era. So we had a salon in Mrs. M's cabinet, which was a concert with the Ruchi Tucci Ragtime Band, and there's a video of that concert on Mrs. M's website, which you could check out. But there are some other sort of like sonic elements. So of course, when you pull that cord and the Pepper's Ghost illusion comes out, she tells her story. And we worked with a fantastic actor who has a very sort of indistinct accent. It's sort of, you're always trying to place, where is this person from? What is her story? So there's that sonic element to the space. Then there's also a bell in Mrs. M's cabinet near the doors to her office where you can turn this bell, and sometimes kids are just in there like ringing this bell all day long, hoping Mrs. M will come down, because there's also a flight of stairs that it's hard to photograph, but in the back of her office, so you can kind of see. And it goes nowhere because this is in the middle of the art museum, right? It's just a gallery. But Mrs. M, you could ring her bell and see if she comes down. So that's part of sort of the sonic quality of the space too. So those are some of the ways that we've engaged with sound. But absolutely, it would be great to have more music in the space. I love that idea.
And from Eliza West, Sarah, is there another room you'd like to create? What story would you like to tell next?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, Mrs. M was kind of a dream project for me in a lot of ways because it connects to a lot of my research interests. And so it was just so wonderful to work with my colleague, John Prown, on it. And it was also connects to a lot of his research interests. So it was a really rich collaboration in that way. I'm very interested right now actually in the history of practice cottages, which were buildings in the early 20th century that were designed for home economics students to actually like practice all of the things that they were learning, but they were also kind of like lab spaces. And they were very unusual homes in that oftentimes, multiple women were living there together at the same time. It was in no way sort of the normative family home, but yet it was a space that was supposed to be training you for your post-graduation life in home economics. And so I'm quite interested right now in some of those spaces because there's a great history of one at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that I've been researching. So that's something I'm quite excited about, but I'm not sure if that story is best told through a period room or through an exhibition or how to tell that story. But those are spaces that are definitely on my mind right now because they're totally fascinating and strange.
And from Bill Hart, I applaud your instinct to make Mrs. M enigmatic, but Kendra's story, which I really like, suggests that you made choices about Mrs. M's race, class, and status. Could you speak about how Mrs. M's cabinet might have been different if her race and class were different, or would that have even been possible given the collection that you had to work with?
It's such an interesting question. And we don't explicitly address Mrs. M's race in the cabinet. And in fact, we talked a lot at various times about, is Mrs. M passing? Like, who is she? Because, she's Mrs. M, but there's no Mr. M, right? She's racially ambiguous. She certainly has the wealth to create a space like this. But we don't know very much about her. And so in making that choice, and I had the opportunity to collaborate, with Kendra Greendeer, who's just a fantastic scholar. She made that assumption about Mrs. M through her work, and having Mrs. M and Kate W have this friendship, right? And so that wasn't something that we explicitly presented about Mrs. M. We don't explicitly talk about her race or her background. There are a lot of questions about Mrs. M. But I think as someone who has spent a lot of time researching 19th century collections, 19th century women in particular, in my own research area, in particular, 19th century educated white women, they've been a big part of the research that I've done because of the collections that survive, that I've had access to. And of course, there are many more collections that more creative researchers will continue to find and stories that will continue to be told. I felt most comfortable presenting Mrs. M as we did. And I think part of my own background in research comes through in how people see and understand Mrs. M, right? I think that is something that kind of inevitably happened, even though we didn't explicitly assign her an age or a race or a place of origin. And I think it's a very interesting question, and perhaps that could change over time. Perhaps if there is a different curator or someone with a different set of research interests, perhaps Mrs. M could become quite different. And I think that's something that's pretty exciting about the character. And I think you're pointing to something so interesting in that question, because my PhD student Kendra, collaborator on that project, came up with her own ideas about Mrs. M's story, right? And that's part of the expansiveness and open-endedness of this project. Like someone else might come up with another idea for a collaboration that might tell us something else about Mrs. M. Like perhaps we learn about some other interest she has through another collaborator or another possibility. And I think that's fantastic. Like I think that's a really good thing. And I do mean it when I say it's open source and open-ended, right? And I think that's part of kind of the feminist possibilities here, that this is an idea, this is a category, it's supposed to be generative, it's supposed to be capacious, it can invite in other interpretations, which frankly doesn't often happen in museum exhibitions or installations, where I think there's often a feeling that there is one way something should be presented. And my hope here is that this is an invitation to collaboration and possibility. But I very much appreciate that question, because just as with historical sources that you could find in an archive that exists in another kind of museum collection, one can make assumptions about Mrs. M through what we've presented about her. And I think it's important to point that out. So thank you for that question.
Related to this question of the contents of a collection being informed by the identity of the collector, I'm curious if your research for this, both in preparation for this installation and just in general, has come across collectors who do seem to collect in service of like a sort of counter narrative in the way that Mrs. M professes to.
I mean, someone like Mary Sheldon Barnes, for example, was very interested in like object-based knowledge because of her background and interest. So she collected a lot of sources, and she was trying to tell a truer story about the past through the objects that she's collecting. Mrs. M is a lot more radical, I think, than the women that I've had the privilege of researching, or I would love to find someone like just like Mrs. M, but I haven't yet. And I think that's potentially, I think, a very rich area for critique of this project. I had one colleague who asked me after presenting on this in a women's history lunch, like a brown bag lunch context, saying basically, this is really interesting, but in creating Mrs. M, are you creating a better ancestor, right? And is that okay or not? So thinking about the same kinds of critiques that have been leveled against, say, Hamilton, the musical, right? Are we in imagining these historical characters in a new way? Are we doing some damage because maybe there weren't characters who were this open-ended or had this expansive view of the 17th century and the 19th century? How much of an historical fantasy is this? And I think that is a really interesting critique that I definitely want to spend more time thinking about, and wonder if future collaborations could address that critique, or if future programs or future ways of developing this concept could help get at that in some new ways, perhaps. Because I think there is this risk of, are you creating a better ancestor, and what does that do? And just like with the colonial revival, what does that hide? What does that erase? What cultural work does a fantasy like that do? And I don't think it's all good, but I do think it opens up ways of reimagining what happens in a museum, because this isn't the only place in the museum that we're doing this kind of work.
All right, well, thank you so much, Sarah. I think that'll bring us to the end of our Q&A, just in the interest of not keeping all of us too late on a Wednesday night. But we are so appreciative of your joining us for this talk. So thank you to Sarah. Thank you to everyone who attended tonight. And just to close out, this talk was presented by the Stuart Swift Research Center with support from Vermont Humanities. But if you'd like to support future programming like this, we would be so grateful if you would donate to the Sheldon Museum and the Stuart Swift Research Center. So thank you, everyone. This talk was recorded, so if you'd like to revisit it, you'll be receiving a link to the recording. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday night.